Now and in the coming years, there are going to be 4 generations represented in the healthcare workforce. Now, it's possible that not all 4 of these generations are represented at your particular organization, but there's a pretty good chance that they are. So this video is going to cover some of the differences between those generations and why it's important to talk about it. The first generation we're going to talk about is the silent generation. This is a photo of Neil Armstrong, who's a member of this generation. Silent generation members were born between 1925 and 1942 roughly, which means that in 2014 they are between 71 and 89 years of age if they're still alive. So some of these people, not all of these people, certainly not all, but some of these people are still going to be in the workforce. Just like every generation, the silent generation was shaped by some of the major events that occurred while they were alive, which includes the Great Depression, a series of wars, including World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. And while we don't want to perpetuate any stereotypes, these events and a whole host of other factors create some sort of common characteristics that silent generation members are likely to share, which include a strong sense of loyalty, dedication to hard work, respect for authority and hierarchy that may not be seen in other generations. Now, the next generation that we're going to talk about is the baby boom generation. Bill Clinton is maybe the quintessential baby boomer, but in fact the past 3 presidents have all been baby boomers, including George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964, which means that in 2014 they were somewhere between 49 and 68 years of age. Now, keep in mind that these boundaries are kind of loose, but most of the baby boomers are between 49 and 68. The major events that influenced the baby boomers include things like Neil Armstrong landing on the moon, the Vietnam War. The civil rights movement was incredibly important to the baby boom generation, as was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now again, a whole host of factors, including these events, shaped some common characteristics that are attributed to the baby boom generation. The baby boom generation is known as the me generation. They were characterized as being pretty self-centered for the time. They were told growing up that they could be anything that they want, which is a value that they've tended to pass along to their kids in Generation X and in the millennial generation. And this characteristic has particular importance related to the aging of the workforce, and I'm just going to spend a minute talking about it. One of the impacts of the women's rights movement in the 1960s and 70s is that there were female members of the baby boom generation who decided to become physicians as opposed to nurses, which was the health career that was available to women up until that point, for the most part. Now, although the women's rights movement was about creating gender equality, the same thing didn't happen for men and nursing until recently. So one of the reasons people talk about nursing shortages is because within the baby boom generation, there were female nurses who were exiting the nursing workforce, essentially, and there were not male nurses entering the workforce. Now, the next generation we're going to talk about is Generation X. The rap artist Jay-Z is a pretty famous Generation Xer. Generation Xers were born between 1965 and 1980. Again, these dates are pretty approximate, which means that in 2014, people in Generation X were somewhere between 34 and 49 years of age. As with the silent generation and the baby boom generation, Generation X was influenced by a whole host of major events, including the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union. The personal computer was developed and commercialized while people in Generation X were growing up. So by the time they get to become adults, Generation Xers are pretty tech savvy and familiar with computers. While some Generation Xers were born before the end of the Vietnam War, some of them would have been old enough to serve in the Gulf War. So the Gulf War was an important event. Now, these events and a whole host of other factors shaped Generation X's characteristics, which include a strong independent streak. Now, this is partly due to the fact that a lot of Generation Xers were latchkey kids. Both of their parents were in the workforce, unlike the baby boom generation, which typically had one primary breadwinner. Generation Xers tend to value work-life balance, and some of these folks may have entered healthcare or be entering healthcare as a second career. The fourth generation currently in the healthcare workforce is the millennial generation. This is a photo of Danica Patrick. Danica is a famous race car driver. She happens to be a woman too. So millennials were born at some point after 1980. Demographers haven't gotten more specific than that, which means that in 2014, people in the millennial generation were 33 years of age or younger. Some of the major events influencing the perspective of millennials include the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and the War on Terror, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Millennials grew up in a globalized economy and also not only use social media, but many of them actually develop the social media tools that many of us use on a daily basis. Millennials were also impacted by the economic recession of 2009. Now, again, these events and other events and cultural trends shape the characteristics of the millennials. Millennials tend to be pretty similar to Generation X in the sense that they value work-life balance and are independent. Millennials tend to be pretty globally minded because of the economy that they grew up in, and they also tend to be, not surprisingly, pretty tech savvy. So why care? Why even mention or describe these four generations? Well, to put a fine point on it, these generational differences do matter. They impact the way that people relate to one another, the way that people view the world that they live in, and they certainly impact the workplace. So if you're in a situation where you're interacting with somebody at work and they are approaching something really differently than you are, just keep in mind that the differences that you're recognizing may not be entirely the fault of the person you're talking with. And it's also probably useful to remember that you grew up in a particular culture and a particular time which shaped the way that you understand the world. Now, just to use sort of a specific example related to communication. Communication is, of course, really important and really hard to do sometimes in a healthcare setting. And while a member of the baby boom generation might feel perfectly comfortable sending and receiving text messages to communicate with their coworkers, that may not be the case, and they may not necessarily prefer it in the way that a member of the millennial generation might, simply because that millennial grew up texting, and that's their main mode of communication. Now, to use another example related to loyalty. People in the millennial generation were told all throughout their childhood that they should expect to have 6 to 7 major career changes throughout their working lives. This is very different from the baby boom generation. So if you're a member of the baby boom generation and you're working with a millennial who doesn't seem particularly loyal to the organization, just keep in mind that they grew up in a very different culture at a very different time than you did. Now, the bottom line here is that whether it's loyalty or communication or some other factor, there are differences on average between generations and individuals' relationships to work. So the question moving forward for you and other people in your organization is, will those generational differences that are going to be there no matter what you do, are they going to be a barrier to your success, or will you treat them as an asset and a way to grow and strengthen your organization? Now, this depends in large part on how your organization manages age diversity within the workplace. Do people from different generations in the workplace learn from each other, or do those differences get in the way of success? Boston College has a program called the Sloan Center for Aging and Work that does a lot of really important and good work in this area related to these types of issues. They put out a study called the Age and Generations Study that reminds us that in addition to these different generations, it's important to keep in mind that employees of all ages might be early, mid, or late career workers. They might have been on the job for a short amount of time or a long amount of time regardless of their age. And they might have responsibilities for caring for dependents. This could include caring for kids or caring for elderly parents, or whoever. The point is, each one of these workers is going to be affected by a whole lot more than just their chronological age. I encourage you to go to the Boston College Sloan Center for Aging and Work's website. I gave the URL on the previous slide, and this is just a screenshot of what their homepage looks like.